Hello everyone, this is learning outcome number 4 of module 7, where we will start to talk about the lower respiratory tract, and within it the first structure is the larynx. So in the last learning outcome we talked about the pharynx, which was the last structure of the upper respiratory system. So now we're starting with the lower respiratory system, which includes the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. Now, the larynx will begin at the level of vertebra 3 or 4, and it will end at the level of vertebra 7. Now, do you need to know these vertebrae and the location? Not necessarily, but just so you have an idea, I want you to realize that the larynx is located within the cervical region. It is essentially a cylinder which will have cartilaginous walls that are stabilized by ligaments or skeletal muscles or even both. Now in these images, I have delineated the larynx in all of them by this blue box. So we can see it over here on this image, on this one as well, just a small portion of it, and on the right image as well. Then the trachea is delineated right over here. We can see it on the middle image and also in the image to the right. The bronchi, I have selected it with the green box right over here. And the lungs are located on the middle and on the right image as well. Now let's start talking about the cartilages that will form the larynx. There are 3 large unpaired cartilages, of which we see 2 of them on this slide. The first one is what we call the thyroid cartilage, and like the name says, it's going to be located right where we have the thyroid gland, and it's the largest of all of the unpaired cartilages. And as you can see from this image, it's going to be located right inferior to the hyoid bone, and on the anterior view, you can see that it occupies all of it. And when we look at a lateral view, it also forms part of the lateral wall. But on a posterior view, it disappears because it does not go all the way around. So the thyroid cartilage is only located on the anterior and the lateral walls of the tract. Now, the thyroid cartilage is formed by 2 halves that will merge anteriorly, and it forms a very thick ridge, especially in men, and this ridge is called the laryngeal prominence, and it can very easily be felt, especially again in men, and this thyroid cartilage area is commonly called Adam's apple. Now, the inferior surface of the thyroid cartilage, it will articulate with the next unpaired cartilage, which is what we call the cricoid cartilage. Therefore, we can say that the thyroid cartilage will sit superior to the cricoid cartilage. Now, different from the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage actually forms a complete ring, which the posterior portion is actually going to be larger than the anterior portion, and therefore it will provide support in the absence of the thyroid cartilage, which is not located posteriorly. And because there's no thyroid cartilage posterior, it can be a little bit larger. So we can see right over here, notice all of this on the posterior view is part of the cricoid cartilage. And notice how the cricoid cartilage anteriorly is smaller in width. Now, the cricoid and the thyroid cartilages, they will protect the glottis, which is where our vocal cords are going to be located, and we'll see this very soon. And also the entrance to the trachea, which is the bottom portion below the cricoid cartilage. Next, we have the epiglottis, which is the last large cartilage, and it forms this shoehorn-shaped structure that will project superior to the glottis. So this structure over here is the glottis, and notice how the epiglottis is located superior to it. And this is why it's called epiglottis, where epi means above. And during swallowing, the larynx is going to be elevated and the epiglottis will fold back over the glottis to prevent the entry of liquid or solid food into the respiratory passageway. And I will show you how this process occurs in the next 2 slides. Also, in addition to the 3 large unpaired cartilages, we have 3 pairs of laryngeal cartilages that are tiny little cartilages. We can't really see them in these images because they're tiny little cartilages, but they're called arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform cartilages. And again, these are paired cartilages, so you will have one on each side. So like we saw on the previous slide, the glottis is going to be located inferior to the epiglottis, and this is where the sound will be produced. As we can see, there are going to be 2 folds, the vocal and the vestibular fold. The vocal fold is this band of elastic tissue, therefore is going to be highly elastic or stretch. And these vocal folds are the ones that will vibrate and produce the sound. And this is why they're known as true vocal cords. And because the vestibular fold, it plays no part in sound production, then they're called the false vocal cords. We can also see over here the inner lining of the trachea. So this would be the posterior side, and this other opposite to it would be the anterior side. You can also see the root of the tongue right over here, and notice the epiglottis. So when we swallow, the epiglottis will actually cover the glottis. And again, we'll see how this works in the next slide. Now, the production of sound or the sound pitch will depend on 3 things: the diameter, the length, and the tension of the vocal folds. Now, the diameter and the length are going to be related to the size of the larynx, and the tension is going to be controlled by the contraction of the skeletal muscles that surround the larynx. Now let's see how the swallowing process or deglutition occurs and the role of the epiglottis in this function. The first thing that occurs is, of course, you have to have food in your mouth and you're going to chew it very well to form what we call a bolus. The tongue will force this compacted bolus into the oral pharynx. But before it does that, you can see that the air that's coming in through the external nares, going through the nasal cavity, suffering that turbulence inside of the nasal cavity, then passing through the whole pharynx, therefore the nasal pharynx, the oral pharynx, and the laryngeal pharynx will then enter into the trachea freely. Another thing that I want to point out is that the esophagus, which like we know runs posterior to the trachea, has right at the beginning what we call a sphincter. In this case, it's called the upper esophageal sphincter. And when you're breathing, this sphincter stays closed. Therefore, nothing is entering into the esophagus. Now, the laryngeal movement folds the epiglottis once you're trying to swallow the bolus. And the pharyngeal muscles, they will push the bolus into the esophagus. And when they do this, they will force the epiglottis to actually come down and block the trachea. Therefore, it blocks the bolus from entering into the trachea and therefore forces it to go down the esophagus. Now, the bolus will then move along the esophagus, and once it continues down into the stomach, the larynx will return to the normal position, as we can see over here, and then you're able to breathe again. So this is why when your mom tells you not to talk while you're eating, is because she does not want you to choke with your food, because when you're talking, you're breathing. Therefore, the epiglottis is in its normal position. But when you're chewing and swallowing, then the epiglottis needs to come down to close the opening to the trachea so that the food does not enter into the trachea. But if you're doing both at the same time, talking and swallowing at the same time, then your body will not know what to do with the epiglottis. And this is how you can choke on your food. So it's important that you concentrate when you're eating so that this does not occur.